Okay, good morning, everybody. Hope you are doing good. Today we will talk about norms, unpopular norms, and the enforcement of unpopular norms, which is a really fascinating thing, which is why would people enforce something that they don't want, right? And we end up with something that nobody wants at the end. But first, before we get into that, let me mention again, you guys saw it, I uploaded the assignment. It's on Blackboard. You see it there. It's on Blackboard, the procedure for the assignment. You download it from Blackboard. I'll show you in a second where you find it exactly again. It's under syllabus, but also under assessment. You complete the assignment. You will see there are 3 parts of the assignment, so complete all 3 parts of the assignment. And then submit it through Blackboard. So that's sort of the important thing. Blackboard, that's the essential thing, right? I wasn't quite sure. I'm new to this university, so I don't really know what the procedures are completely. The online submission is the key. Yeah, that's sort of the key. You need to submit it online. The hard copy, if you want to submit it, you can. If you don't, I don't know. I don't care. But online, that's sort of what counts. Okay. Let me just quickly show you so that we all know what we're doing. So when you go into Blackboard, into syllabus, there you are. That's sort of where the assignment is. I just put it up there. But you also find it when you go into assessment. Exactly the same assignment here as well. This is sort of, don't get blinded by that, actually I just changed that. This is the right assignment. Okay. Okay, so let's get started. Today I want to talk about norms, enforcement of norms, and unpopular norms. More precisely, I have these 4 things. Let's see how far we get with that. First of all, talk a little bit about what social norms are. Then, in that context, also how we think about norms. Why do we have norms? Then I present 2 alternative explanations, which are sort of in line with the kind of reasoning that we had before so far in this course. Maybe it's about people following others, right, with certain norms. Then we get into a 3rd explanation, which is a very interesting one, which is false enforcement. That's sort of this part where people enforce certain norms even though they don't believe in it. Right? The key here is, or that's the idea of this false enforcement, that this is a strong signal to signal sincerity. Right? If you are in a group and you want to show that you have an understanding of art, you criticize others for not understanding some fancy art. That's sort of the idea. That is sort of it's a mechanism that is outlined, portrayed here, and it has the consequence of it is that it's extremely stable and that it can explain the norms we have. And at the end, there are sort of 2 studies that I want to touch upon where folks actually looked at this false enforcement in an experimental way. Okay, let's get started with social norms. We all know social norms are around us all the time, right? We experience it all the time. What are social norms? Let me first have a definition. Social norms are unwritten rules about how to behave. Yeah? They provide us with an expected idea of how to behave in a particular group, situation, or culture. You experience it all the time. Just think about your everyday life. And here I have some examples of what are social norms, that we have direct eye contact with people when we are speaking with them. There's some norms are sort of a little, in the movie theater, if you go to the empty seat, sort of, or you do not pick your nose in public. You wear clothing. That's a social norm. And actually, in the false enforcement of norms, we come back to this children's story of the naked emperor, which is where this whole idea of false enforcement is being exemplified. We say thank you. We stop at the red light. We pull over for emergency vehicles. We do not talk with food in our mouth. You know, there's sort of all sorts of different things, and you notice there are no, there's no rule book or anything like that, right? Nobody wrote, well, I don't know, there's no law about these kind of things, right? But still, we all seem to know about that, and you know, we all seem to agree on it. But how did that happen? You know, how did that come about? And when you travel around the world, you are in very different cultures, or you're exposed to completely different people. Then sometimes you notice that suddenly there are sort of other norms in place, right? Sort of those guys, they kiss each other 3 times to each side, and you don't really know what's happening when you're coming from the Scandinavian countries in a way, right? Actually, it's one study I'm looking at exactly that. I'm looking at norms around greeting practices. So how do people say hello to each other? Yeah. There are very different norms about that. So there are different kinds of norms. You know, we can distinguish between prescriptive norms. These are basically norms that say what we should not do. Yeah. I don't know, don't poke your nose. Yeah. Don't be impolite. And we have prescriptive norms that tell us what to do. Right? Okay, so why do we have norms? Yeah, and that's actually a very fascinating field of study, and you know, you can have a whole semester about that, about norms and how they come about. It's a very fascinating field of study, and some of my colleagues work a lot on that, and they devote their whole careers on these kind of things. But why do we have norms? Right? Well, one straightforward explanation is that they do make sense. Yeah? And here the idea is, and that's sort of the traditional way how we thought about norms so far, was that they are useful. They are useful somehow. And then there are different theoretical strands, you know, and you know, you have all these different theoretical positions, but they all sort of converge on this idea that norms are useful. Yeah? Norms sort of are helpful in whatever way. And then there's sort of a functionalist perspective. You know, maybe you came across functionalist theory before. There the idea really is that, you know, everything that we have in society is sort of, it fulfills a function. Like a family has a function, or a society has a function in a way, or the way we organize our life is functional. Yeah, it's sort of, it leads to, it has a purpose. And here the idea is norms are useful to the society at large. When you think about conflict theory, you know, that's another perspective that looks at that. From that point of view, norms are useful to the dominant groups. In conflict theory, it's all about the struggle between different groups. And here the idea is norms help to maintain and establish the order that we have. Or another perspective would be an utilitarian theory, which says that, you know, norms are useful to those people who enforce them. Okay, but why do we have unpopular norms? Yeah? Norms that nobody wants. Okay, so now I'm suggesting here, based on the literature, 2 alternative explanations against these traditional views of looking at norms, that they are just simply useful. Yeah? So 2 alternatives are based on this idea, you know, a bit like what we're doing here in this course, that we talked about social influence. You know, we talked about how our life, in the assignment you will have to talk about, describe things about social influence, and then here the idea is, you know, we are oriented to groups. We are largely influenced by and conform to our peers. Right? We don't know better. I think about little kids. They grow up. They don't know better. They just imitate the behaviors they see around them. You know? And there are sort of certain norms that are being that people live, and then, you know, this is sort of how children pick up that there's certain things that they shouldn't do, right? Okay, and these 2 perspectives, you know, we could call them herding and pluralistic ignorance. Let me talk about each one of them a little bit. So the first idea, herding. Herding means people follow others. You know, it's just, we are just a mindless herd, and it's based on this idea that so many others, they cannot be wrong. right? If others do follow a certain norm, if other people have a certain greeting practice, that seems to be what others do, so they must have a reason for that, right? Or there must be a reason for why other people don't misbehave in public, for example. So the idea of herding is that we follow others. It's about social influence in a direct way. Others live a norm and we follow them. And now this kind of can help us to understand unpopular norms. Because when you remember how we had these social influence effects, how that can happen, now hopefully by now you understand that kind of then small things can trigger big changes, right? Sort of a small thing at the beginning can lead to some other people adopting a norm, can lead to other people adopting a norm, can lead to other people adopting a norm, and so on and so forth. And at the end, we end up with an unpopular norm that we might not want. So it could be about early movers. Well, it's another question about why some early movers would follow an unpopular norm. But it could be about some people introducing a norm and then others following from that. So people follow the crowd and are led to decisions that are sometimes inconsistent with or even contradictory to what they privately believe. Yeah. Well, it could be that these early movers, that for those guys, a certain norm makes sense, right? But for most of the people, it doesn't. But then the other people follow. You know, that's sort of the herding. They follow the herd, and then ultimately we end up with a norm that might be vastly unpopular. It's also this idea of rational imitation, you know, that's what we had before already, that so many others cannot be wrong. Okay, let me talk about the second suggestion or alternative here. You see how we are sort of using the concepts that I introduced so far during this term to look at norms slightly differently. So the next suggestion is about pluralistic ignorance. What is pluralistic ignorance? Well, pluralistic ignorance means that people might misperceive what the majority thinks. Yeah? And there have been some fascinating studies about that, where people, the classic example is that of the prohibition, yeah, in the States, where, you know, remember there was a time where they thought it's a good idea to ban alcohol completely. Yeah? And what happened, or how the situation was, is that people thought that others are supportive of the norm, that others want alcohol to be banned, and that their own position as somebody who wanted to drink alcohol, that they thought that they are in a minority group. While in fact they were in the majority group. So here the idea really is about misperceiving who's the majority group and who's the minority group in the population. And then behavior following from that. So people suppress their dissent, right? They are unhappy with a certain norm. They don't tell others. They don't change it, right? Because they think they are in the minority and because they think others actually want to have that. And then they copy the behaviors of others who are incorrectly assumed to represent the majority. That's pluralistic ignorance. Now, as I said, the example, during the time of the prohibition, most people thought others were for it, when in reality, most people were against it, including those who were vocal about its initiation. And this is also a fascinating field of study when you look at the mass media. You know, there it's called the spiral of silence. There's a famous book by Elizabeth Neumann about this, where these processes can reinforce each other. Right? You think that you have a minority opinion. I don't know. You're supporting Trump, or you're supporting something else, that you think that you are in a certain context a minority group, and you don't talk about it, right? And that means others actually don't get the sense that there are other people actually thinking about it, and then they don't talk about their opinion in that sense, and then there's a spiral of silence where everybody shuts their mouth, and everybody at the end thinks that they are in the minority group, but in fact they might actually be in the majority group. So that's pluralistic ignorance. And there's an interesting example of that, you know, which is really relevant for you guys, that folks study the drinking behavior and perceived norms of students, yeah, or of high school pupils. And here the fascinating thing was, when you ask, if I would ask you guys about your drinking behavior, and I would ask you about your perceived norms about drinking behavior, about how much others drink, these things widely diverge. So people think that drinking is socially acceptable, or that's what you need to do to be cool and so on, while in fact often a lot of people actually don't want to binge drink and want to get hammered at the weekend, right? But they go along with it because they wrongly perceive their social environment in that way. And then the fascinating thing in that case is, because then even false enforcement happens, that then people who privately oppose the norm of drinking until they are completely wasted, and they even enforce that when they are out with others, and why are you not drinking, right, in order to show how sincere they are. So that's sort of an area where false enforcement happens. So people looked at that, in middle and high schools, and the actual use in alcohol and the perceived use of alcohol about others, they are vastly different. They're vastly different. And then you can have these reinforcements happening, where undergraduate populations just get in a drinking mode because they think others think it's cool to drink, and then they drink, and then others think that it's cool and so on, while in fact nobody wants it. So here are some other results, from a study where I looked at that. The key here really is to look at the difference between the personal use of alcohol and the perceived norms about alcohol. So people think that others drink much more alcohol than they actually do. People think that others drink much more alcohol than they actually do. And this misbalance then changes their behavior, right? Okay. So that's actually pluralistic ignorance. So it's based on the misperception of others, right? And the misperception of who is in the majority and who is in the minority group. And we can summarize that in this way, that our behavior is influenced by our perceptions of what others think and do, right? But, and now there's the big but, and that's something that interests me in my studies on networks a lot, that these perceptions are often inaccurate. They are often inaccurate. And there are many different reasons for that. It can be a structural reason. I study these things. I wrote this paper a year ago where I basically showed that your friends on average have more friends than you do. Yeah. It's one of those weird things, but it's pure logic, right? Because those guys who have lots of friends, they show up in more friendship relationships. And actually I have a follow-up paper where I looked at attractiveness and health of your friends as well, not of your friends, but it's just in general with a data set on Facebook. Actually, I looked at that, and it turns out not only do your friends on average have more friends than you do, but they are also better looking and they are healthier than you. Yeah. And then you wonder, how can that be? Well, but again, it's a very logical argument that I'm establishing in this paper. If you want to know more about that, it's in this paper that I wrote. But the key point here is that our perceptions of the world and the realities of the world, they might not be the same. Actually, often they are different, right? Now remember about where we are with analytical sociology. We have these macro level phenomena that kind of play a role for how individuals behave and how individuals act, right? And then individuals act, and then everybody acts in a certain way, and then we have some other macro level phenomena, right? It's sort of this Coleman's boat. And now you see that kind of when we go from the first macro level down to the individual level, this is sort of where we are here right now. Things can go wrong, right? People misperceive their environments, and as a consequence of that, certain behaviors happen that would not have happened if people would have correctly assessed the situation. And the example of the drinking norms is, I think, a very, very interesting one in that sense. Okay, why do people misperceive norms? Well, there's a natural tendency to generalize observed behaviors. Whatever you experience around you, you generalize from that. Can be, in the media, certain things can be portrayed or whatnot. Anyway, okay, so now we talked about norms, first of all, being useful, right? That they fulfill a purpose, that they make sense. But then, kind of now I introduced two alternatives that sort of seem to give us a better grasp at norms that are unpopular, that don't make sense. that kind of people follow others, or that there's pluralistic ignorance, which leads to something like binge thinking at the weekend, although nobody actually wants it. Right? It's not useful for society, not from any theoretical point of view. So these are sort of now two alternatives that kind of help us to understand unpopular norms. But still, these two alternatives, they suffer from the problem that they are incredibly unstable. Yeah? So it could be very easily that then, I don't know, people say, somebody speaks out and says, okay, this is sort of who the majority group is, then the whole thing would collapse. Right? So a third way of looking at that, and that's sort of what we will talk about for the rest of the lecture, that's actually false enforcement, which is incredibly interesting because it makes unpopular norms. It does not only explain unpopular norms, but it also explains why they can be so stable. Okay, so we can explain, you know, why people comply to unpopular norms. You know, maybe they fear social sanctions, or maybe they just follow others. And we can even think about why people would pressure others to behave the way they want them to behave. Right? If you have a certain idea about this is how your evening should look like, and then you tell the people around you, let's all get drunk. You know, this is sort of my mission for the evening in a way. But the really interesting thing is, why would people publicly enforce a norm that they secretly wish would go away? And that's something we can observe in many different scenarios. And that's sort of where this idea of false enforcement comes into play. Yeah. And the classic example, I come back to that in a second, you know, this children's story about the naked emperor, right? Who basically, you know, is being told by three rogues that here is a new dress for him, yeah? But that only the intelligent people, or only the ones that are worthy, can actually see the dress. Right? And then the emperor sort of, well, obviously there's no dress, right? But the emperor, he doesn't want to admit that he's not worthy of it, yeah? that he cannot see it, so he goes along with it. And then he walks around and shows everybody in his kingdom his new dress, right? And people start adhering to the same norm. Because nobody wants to admit that they can't see it, right? Because maybe, you know, and then they even enforce others to actually see it. Why can't you see it, right? Why can't you see it? And so on. Until finally a little children breaks the spell and laughs out in laughter, right? And says, this is just a naked old guy. Yeah? And then the whole thing falls apart. So false enforcement, you know, we see it in many different settings. You know, remember, I had you guys read this article from Alan Sokol in one of the first lectures, and in the academic business, you know, it's very widely spread that people write stuff that is just completely incomprehensible, doesn't make sense, yeah? And then just people worship other people for that, right? And they go along with it, right? And then they even tell, oh, you don't understand this guy, right? You're stupid. So what is the thing here? You know, they enforce a certain norm about what is good work, right? Because it actually makes them look better, right? Or another example where we had that is with witch hunts, right? There's sort of a similar dynamic that is evident. Witch hunts, or that back in the days, you know, it was sort of a big thing, you know. Witch hunts were not only caused by an outbreak of deviance, but they were caused by an outbreak of enforcement. Yeah? So people started pointing at each other. And witches were created by anxious neighbors seeking to affirm their status in the community by accusing others of deviance. So the thing that happened is that, you know, people wanted to make sure, or they wanted to be very the best way to kind of show that you are not a witch is by pointing to others who are witches. Yeah. And then even more on the top of that, later on, you know, there was the best confession, and there's another quote, I might have it here in the slides, the best confession, or the most sincerest confession that then a witch could actually make, right, to finally get relieved from the torture and so on was by pointing towards other people that they saw together with the devil. So by revealing others, that sort of signals sincerity into the statements that they made. So those accused can save themselves only by revealing the names of yet other neighbors and so on and so forth. Yeah. And perhaps no one in this population actually believes in the existence of witches, yet a terrific public turns out to cheer at the executions, and public, and there's collective anxiety that they created all by themselves. Yeah. And this self-reinforcing dynamic can indeed grasp a whole community. And when you look at historically, there are some fascinating studies about how these witch hunts actually happened. Right? It really was a chain of events like that, where somebody was accused of being a witch, and then some other people accused others, and so on, and the whole thing unraveled, and it followed a dynamic like the one that I just described. Okay, another example really is in the art market. I was at this art exhibition on Friday evening, sort of, people showed their paintings on display. Some of them were just really bad. It was just horrible, But they had a price tag on it, €1,000 or more, and it just looked fancy. And then you look at that, and in the art world, because it is so difficult it's a bit like a naked emperor, right? It's sort of so difficult to say what is sort of the quality standards that we apply here. I ask around the people. I'm a social scientist. You're on duty all the time. Yeah? I ask around the folks standing there. So, what is good art for you? Right? Or how do you evaluate that? And what you see here is often in the art market is people sort of appreciate a piece of work because others seem to appreciate it, right? So they follow a norm, they follow a majority norm here. Right? This is very expensive, so this must be good. Others seem to appreciate it. And then the interesting thing is that then there's also force enforcement happening here. And then people who privately think that it's a piece of crap, they kind of then ask others, why can't you see the value of this? Right? So that's sort of the idea behind false enforcement. Not to say that this happens all the time, but it's one mechanism that is outlined that was introduced by some guys a few years back. It was in the readings, Michael Macy and others. Fascinating dude. How these norms can come about, and sort of one element in there that we had not really thought about before. So here are some other examples of false enforcement, of compliance with and then ultimately enforcement of privately unpopular norms. So things that people are actually don't agree with in private, but in public they seem to, and even more, they seem to enforce it. For example, the exposure of the politically incorrect by the righteously indignant who thereby affirm their own moral integrity. Right? So like a political belief or something that you think is politically incorrect, and then you point it out to others. Well, why did you do like that? Why did you behave like that? Yeah. Or gossiping about in various forms. It's about our cultural sophistication. Think of the art market example that I had. Public adoration of a bully by fearful schoolboys who do not want to become the next victim. Maybe this is sort of most understandable here. Or a luxury fever. People wrote about that, where people seek status through display of expensive goods, while in fact they couldn't care less about it, right? But they do it because they think that's sort of how they can display their status, and then they even start enforcing it. Right? They kind of, why are you not having the fanciest watch or the fanciest handbag or whatnot? So all these are sort of examples of this idea of false enforcement, which is the public enforcement of a norm by people who privately oppose it. And it goes back to this children's story by Hans Christian Andersen. Maybe you came across it. It's the naked emperor. Hence, it's also called the Emperor's Dilemma, where three rogues come along who sell a foolish monarch a non-existent robe that they claim cannot be seen by those who are unfit for office or incorrectly be stupid. So only intelligent people can see the rope. And then fear of exposure leads the emperor, and in turn then all the citizens, and to express admiration for the new clothes, and everybody says, oh, they're so wonderful, they're so great, while in fact that's just nothing. Right? And then the spell is broken by a child who laughs at the naked old guy. And one of the readings was, it had in the title The Emperor's Dilemma. That's sort of where some guys, some folks at the time at Cornell, introduced this idea of force enforcement. And in this paper, they actually demonstrated through computer simulations how such a mechanism can actually lead to very stable norms. But I won't get into the details of it, but the idea, the gist really is that the secret of success is sincerity, and if you can fake that, you've got it made, right? So it's not enough to kind of go along with something. You need to display to others that you're sincere about it, right? That's sort of a key signal. And so false enforcement is the most sincere way how you can actually demonstrate that you're really sure, that you seem to be sincere about it. This is this quote that I mentioned earlier, that naturally the best proof of the sincerity of your confession was you naming others whom you had seen in the devil's company. That sort of goes back to the witch hunts. The best way you could actually show that what you say is true is by pointing towards other people that you've seen in the company of the devil. Okay, so in this paper, I won't get into the details of it. They use agent-based computer simulations. They basically simulate a world. I invite you to have a look at this paper. It's not a required reading, but it's a fascinating paper. They use agent-based computer simulations where they simulate a world with this force enforcement. So how would it look like if people kind of follow the norms that are being created by the people around them, and how would it look like if they start following a norm when a certain fraction of people around them follows the norm, even though personally they oppose it. So they are no true believers. And so basically, the idea here is that those who admire the emperor out of a desire for social approval fear that their posturing will be apparent to others, and then they look for some way to confirm their sincerity and enforcing a norm, even though they might privately not believe in it, is sort of a low-cost signal. It's a low-cost signal to fake sincerity. What are the findings in this study? They find that false enforcement can make unpopular norms extremely stable. It can be extremely stable because people keep reinforcing a certain norm, right? And at the end, what they also show is that at the end, there might be a world where nobody of the original people who introduced the norm is there anymore, but because there's constant enforcement and so on of the norm prevails. Furthermore, a small number of true believers, so these are the people that actually really believe in the thing, right? They believe that this is sort of, these are the clothes of the emperor and so on. A small number of true believers suffices to generate norms that most of the people do not want. So when we apply this idea, I already mentioned this before, with the college drinking or undergraduate perceptions about drinking behavior and actual drinking behavior, when we apply it to that idea, it would go along those lines, that students who worry about social acceptance may be tempted to drink and to celebrate intoxication in order to appear cool, because they think that's what others do. However, they must not appear to be motivated by this goal, and they risk being scorned as a poser, right? So it's kind of, you need to be credible. That you're not kind of trying to do this just to follow the norm, just to appear cool. So, and the best way to actually do that is it's not just enough to party, but it's the enforcement or the expression that one actually really believes in that, and it can kind of show and demonstrate sincerity. So they must also express the belief that drinking is cool and act accordingly, thereby adding to the social pressure that leads others like them to join in. You see sort of how the dynamic then spins up. So that's an example of that. Okay, so those guys at Cornell, they had first their simulation paper, which is fascinating to read. But then they also did some experimental studies. I'm going to talk more about that now, where they looked at how does the false enforcement of unpopular norms actually happen, or does it happen? Because in an agent-based simulation, you make certain assumptions. You think about, okay, how would the world look like if these are the rules, right? Or these are how individuals behave, and these are how they depend on each other. What would follow from that? That's sort of the basic idea of an agent-based model. Yeah? And it allows you, sure we will come back to that, it allows you to simulate complexity. Yeah? Things that are very simple, they're very trivial in terms of how people behave, but they become incredibly complex because everybody seems to influence each other in a certain way. Right? And then you have these dynamics that unfold, like the drinking norm, right? Because people behave in a certain way, which then kind of leads to others think in a certain way, which then makes them behave in a certain way, which then changes the perceptions of others, and so on and so forth. So these kind of things, that's sort of where agent-based models come into play, where they are really useful and where they are really cool. But now it's all about the micro-level assumptions. So, or how does the false enforcement of unpopular norms actually happen, or does it happen? And the question they ask in this other paper that you guys had on the required readings was, can social pressure lead to false enforcement of norms? Can we pressure people to enforce a norm that they privately oppose? That's sort of the question that they had in this study. And how cool is that? They asked undergraduate students, guys like you, to drink wine, to participate in a wine drinking exercise, and then praise the wines afterwards. Right? And you will see, I'll talk more about that, about how then they evaluated similar wines, and how even more, how they evaluated the judgments of their fellow students. Right? Said who's sort of a good wine connoisseur here. Right? And then they kind of started not only to follow the norms about what is sort of a false norm, what is sort of a good wine, although it wasn't a good wine, and then it was exactly the same wine, but then on the top of that, they started to evaluate, to value down, to rate down other students who they thought did not follow the norms. And the interesting part was that they did that even then when they personally didn't agree with what the good wine was. Okay, so that's sort of one study. I'm going to talk about that. And the second one really follows up on the reading of SOCAL. Right? Actually, this is sort of where I got the idea. Reading this article first at the beginning of the term, and I thought this is cool. I need to have you guys read it. So they actually had other students read parts of that article. Yeah? Remember the transgressing the boundaries of quantum hermeneutics or quantum gravity, something like that. Yeah? Who cares? So they had students read that and then had them appreciate and value this piece of work, for its scholarly value. And then afterwards, after they revealed what others actually said about this text, they had them rate their fellow students in terms of how good are they in judging academic work. And that's sort of where the false enforcement comes into play. But let me first talk about the wine study. The wine study. Yeah. So, I like these kind of studies because they're very, very straightforward. They're kind of very simple. This is sort of, now again, this is sort of an experimental design that they have here. They basically brought in students. They brought in around 52 students, guys like you. They had them sit in sort of little cubicles, had them separated from each other. And they told them that they would participate. They always had 6 students coming in into one session. They have a session and then they have another session and so on. And they told them they would participate on a test on aesthetic tastes in different domains. Actually, it was even more sneaky. First, they sent out an email where students had to take a test about which would reveal their quality to judge aesthetics, or to have a good taste. And then they, at the end of clicking their way through, they told students, okay, you made the cut, you succeeded, you have such a high value in assessing things, you are invited to a study about wine. Right? while in fact they said this to everybody. Right? So it was just complete fake, but it kind of heightened the sensation for the assessment of taste or in aesthetics. Okay, so how did this work? So I had these 6 people coming in. They were all sitting there in their little cubicles, separated from each other. You know? And then they were told that they would interact with the other 5 people in the room. Right? But they were all separated from each other. Everybody was sitting in front of their computer. But they were told that through the computer they would interact with the other 5 people in the room. While in fact what happened, they interacted with simulated participants. So they interacted with the computer. Right? There was not sort of the real people there, but it was sort of a fake participant. Okay, so then they got wine. Yeah? They had 3 glasses of wine, and how cool is that? That's sort of a study, and they drink wine. And they were given 3 wines. All 3 wines were in fact the same. All 3 wines were exactly the same, except that the 3rd one was tainted with vinegar. Right? So if anything, the 3rd one was really bad, and the other 2 were exactly the same. And then what they did, they said that they explained this to students that they are following an old Dutch ritual of evaluating wine, you know, like the Dutch round, which is that they drink all wine, then they kind of reveal which ones they liked, and then they afterwards, in a round, they reveal how much they appreciate the evaluations of others. Yeah? There's no Dutch round of drinking wine or of evaluating wine or tasting wine. You know, they made this up as the story to get into the experimental setting that they wanted to have. So participants gave their ratings of the wines after seeing on their computer screen 4 other ratings. They thought that these are 4 other participants in the room, but in fact these were 4 fake participants. They were sort of simulated guys, right? And there you kind of see how I'm going with this, or what they did. They basically portrayed a certain norm. These 4 other guys, they all claimed a huge difference between the first and the second wine, which were in fact exactly the same, right? So others say that kind of 2 wines are different. You know, there are these students sitting there in the little cubicles, not being really sure about what to make out of this wine. They think they have an understanding of wine, but maybe they don't. You know, they start doubting themselves. And now the question is, what happens? How do they rate the wine? Depending on what those other 4 guys said. And the finding is that they actually started to then also signal difference between the first and the second wine, although there actually was no difference. Okay, so that's these first 4 fake ratings. Then the participants gave up their ratings, and then finally there was 1 more fake participant after the participant actually gave their ratings about the wine, which is also a simulated participant. And this other person actually gave the correct rating, yeah? Right? That these wines are exactly the same, and that the 3rd one is really bad. But they said that on the computer screen after the participants typed in their rating. And what we found is that, well, there was conformity to a very large degree. So 53% of the students rated the second wine below the identical first wine, after seeing 4 other ratings of other people that were supposedly in the room that said exactly the same thing. So there was some conformity. So far, so good. But then they did also this additional step at the end, where they had them evaluate the ratings of the people that gave the ratings. Right? Sort of this Dutch round, kind of we stand, we drink, and then afterwards we talk to each other about what we think about how good we were in terms of assessing the wine. And now there we have the experimental condition. I remember there's always this kind of separation. You have a control group and you have a treatment group. Now they sort of have this happening in one setting in public, where they then evaluate each other in public while others or everybody is in the room, and they they had a little chat in their experiment where the participants could chat with each other and so on. And this is sort of where it happens. And the second one is the private condition, where they evaluate the ratings of others, but they're being told that nobody was going to see it, right? So this is sort of where we are. So again, those guys, they come in, they drink wine, they evaluate the wine, and then these ratings happen. And we have 2 conditions. One is sort of the public rating, and the other one is the private rating. And these are the findings. These are the findings. Well, first of all, you see four different groups, conformed, did not conform, conformed, and did not conform. Conformed are those guys that actually followed those four other fake participants, right? While those who did not conform, these are the ones that did not follow those fake participants in the first instance. But then the key thing here is to distinguish private and public. Yeah? Private sort of then depends on the evaluation afterwards, right? So they gave their ratings of their fellow students in private. And the public setting, they were told that they're sort of given their ratings to fellow students in public. And now what you see here is, first of all, there's sort of these two bars. It's a little more complicated: conformist target and deviant target, whatever these things mean. Basically, conformist target are the ones that followed the wrong assessment of the norm, right? Sort of these fake four participants who said that the one wine is actually worse than the other, while the deviant target is the one that actually had the correct assessment. Yeah? They deviated from the norm. Okay, the first thing you see is that when those students evaluated the other students in private, they actually appreciated the ones that went with the true assessment of the wine, right? So they appreciated on the y-axis, that's sort of how much they rated their fellow students. You see that the white bars are higher, are larger, taller than the black bars, and that means that as a student, they rated the fake student who kind of gave the correct assessment of the wine. They said those guys know what they are talking about. Right? But now the key thing is, in the public condition, where they revealed, where they were being told that these ratings would be revealed to others in a round, they didn't go follow that. Right? In fact, they seem to appreciate the group norm, those guys who followed the group norm more. So there you see, this is evidence for false enforcement. Yeah. So when there is a public situation, people actually not only went along with the group norm, but they also, in this case, punished those who didn't follow the group norm. So the fact that on the last two sets of bars, in the public setting, that the white bar is lower than the black bar, that's sort of evidence for the sanctioning of those guys who did not follow the norm, even though they were right. And having the information from the private scenario sort of gives us an idea about what people really thought about those wines. So students complied with the normative opinion to favor one wine over another when the two were actually identical. And when rating of others was public, students sanctioned the lone deviant. So that's sort of this person, this fake participant who actually had the true assessment of the wines. When rating of others was private, students did not sanction the lone deviant. So, to summarize that, and there's another study that I will not get into detail, social pressure to conform to a norm can lead to those who conform to also sanction others for not conforming, which is fascinating when you think about that. And also in terms of the consequences that this might have. So they also did this with the so-called text. If you read the paper, you actually see what they did here. Just as a summary at the end, we should not necessarily assume that people who enforce a norm actually believe in the views of the norm, and even those who kind of pressure others to certain norms, it is not necessarily the case that they actually believe in it. Okay, on Thursday we will talk more, we will get into tipping points, and I don't mean giving money to people, it's more like things where something flips, and see you guys on Thursday.